Hello and welcome back. Please remember to complete all assignments and discussions in the module before the posted due date. Keep up with the assigned readings. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. In this lecture, we will discuss ethnoarchaeology as well as mortuary studies. First, we need to define what ethnoarchaeology is. Ethnoarchaeology is the study of living populations to explore and address archaeological questions. It's a way to study the behaviors of living populations to help understand past ones. It's essentially archaeologists conducting an ethnography. Ethnoarchaeology is very important in mortuary archaeology because burials are distinct classes of human behavior. Ethnoarchaeology lets us explore the variation and social significance of that behavior globally. In order to understand the ethnoarchaeology of mortuary studies, we first need to explore the philosophy of mortuary archaeology. Let's look at some of the key older philosophies of what a burial embodied. In his 1971 article, Binford went through some of these, and we're going to discuss a few of these here, and then we're going to relate it back to ethnoarchaeology. So first we're going to begin with Tyler. In 1871, Tyler argued that animism, a belief in spiritual beings, resulted in a body-soul dichotomy that was projected into the death situation. Here he said that the soul survived after the destruction of the body. Therefore, he interpreted that burial was important. Another idea was proposed by Fraser in 1886. Here, Fraser said that mortuary ritual was motivated by fear of the deceased's ghost soul. And mortuary ritual was an attempt by the living to control the ghosts of the dead. Fraser's example was that the living pile stones on top of a grave, yet they leave food in a tomb, and they dress the dead in the best clothing. And this was meant to induce the perturbed spirit to rest in the grave and not to come plaguing the living for food and raiment. So really, Fraser's saying that we create these monuments not to the dead, but for the dead, and that we leave food for the dead, and we dress them up all nice and leave all the stuff with them, basically to keep them happy, to keep them from coming after us. Other ideas varied, including Yarrow in 1880, who said that mortuary customs have a deep significance because, quote, in them are revealed much of the philosophy of the people by whom they are practiced. This is an interesting quote. Basically, Yarrow is saying that mortuary customs reflect not the people who are dead, but reflect the actions and behaviors of the people who were alive that buried them. Yet another concept came along, was proposed by Tyler, not Taylor, but Tyler. In 1921, Tyler wrote that the changes in the mode of disposal of the dead are evidently the results of changed views concerning the future life. And changes in the mode of the disposal of the dead, changes in how we bury our dead, are the results of different views that people had concerning what happened after death. So given these theories, we need to ask ourselves, do they adequately describe and apply to all burials? Or is there something else that we have not yet considered? There's quite a bit more. We need to think about the social status of the deceased. Here, Hertz, published in 1960, but written much earlier than that, said, quote, the emotion provoked by death varies wildly in intensity according to the social character of the deceased. Basically, we need to ask ourselves, how do burials differ based on social character? We can observe different treatment of the body, different grave goods that are included with the body. We have different degrees of monumentality, different monuments that are constructed atop burials or around a burial. We also have different locations where bodies are laid, and we have different degrees of social memory of the deceased. Basically, we have differences in the mortuary ritual, and these differences vary according to the status of the person within the community and the perceived relationship of that status to the status of a participant in the, quote, society of souls. Basically, this really isn't that different from our for most westernized traditions. Based differences in the ways that we bury people in the mortuary record are based on status. Wealthier individuals typically have more elaborate tombs or graves, or more grave goods. And we have to think about that perceived relationship, that status, to the status of a participant in the society of souls. Here we have to think about religious connotations affiliated with burial markers. So these theories are okay, but they are still missing something important. They are inadequate because they fail to explain differences that are observed in mortuary rituals. In the 1920s, there was a broad theoretical revolution in anthropology, and this included archaeology as well. And this broad revolution introduced a desire to explain social behaviors rather than just theorize them. Rather than just kind of say, I think this is going on, and I think that this behavior reflects something else. Instead, they wanted to come up with explanations for those behaviors. Concrete explanations. In 1922, Radcliffe Brown studied burial customs of Andaman Islanders, and he explained their burial customs as a collective reaction against the attack on the collective feeling of solidarity constituted by the death of a member of the social group. In this way, burial customs reinforced community identity and solidarity. Do we use funerals to reinforce identity and solidarity today? Think about that. When was the last time you were at a funeral? Did that funerary ritual, the funeral itself, or the activities before or after the funeral, did they reinforce some sense of identity and solidarity? Furthermore, Radcliffe Brown felt that by, quote, by death, the social personality is not annihilated, but undergoes a profound change. Here I need to ask you to reflect upon yourself. Do you agree that death brings a change to the social personality of the deceased? Because in some cultures they would say, maybe. In this manner, mortuary traditions serve as a form of liminality. Liminality is a liminal space, is a space between. Mortuary traditions are a transitional stage between the death of the individual and the return to the normal functions of the social group. Mortuary traditions are one component of the process of death and of grieving. And those traditions, those funerary rites, those behaviors, serve as a rite of passage. In the 1970s, some new approaches to the study of the dead were initiated. And this coincided with the new archaeology, or what we refer to as processualism. Processualism was first developed in the 1960s, and it really took on in the 1970s. And one important component of processualism, or the new archaeology, was something called middle range theory. Middle range theory attempts to connect past with present behaviors. It uses ethnographies to find analogies to behaviors that may have occurred in the past. And modern mortuary rituals are observed to find parallels with archaeological ones. Lou Binford was one of the key proponents of processualism, of what was then called the new archaeology. He felt that there would be a direct correlation between social rank of the deceased and the number of relationships to the deceased. Basically, the more important you are, the more people exist in your network. He also felt that the funerary expression of the deceased's social persona varied directly with the social persona in life. Basically, that the decedent's funeral reflected their power and their popularity. Binford studied 40 different cultures from the Human Relations Area Files, the HRAF. And he figured that complexity was reflected by 4 types of subsistence production. First, he said that complexity reflected hunters and gatherers. Then it shifted to agriculturalists. Then it shifted again to settled agriculturalists. And then also pastoralists. He then listed age, sex, social position, condition of death, location of death, and social affiliation for the deceased. Binford found that settled agriculturalists took these elements into account in symbolizing the social persona of the deceased in funerary rituals. So if you're saying, well, what does this mean? It means that more complex societies have more complex funerary traditions, and they try to represent more information about the deceased in those mortuary traditions. Now, another key anthropologist that we need to consider here is Sachs. He proposed 8 cross-cultural hypotheses. First, that if we combine the various aspects of funerary treatment, disposal above or underground versus grave goods being present or absent, we have a set of permutations in which the different combinations may represent different social personae. So sometimes these can be correlated, but not always. We don't always have a correlation between disposal, underground, and the presence or absence of grave goods, right? So sometimes this works, but not always. Second, Sachs said that we need to consider how social personae are decided and created, and that this creation and decision of social personae is linked to the principles organizing social relations in that society. Here we need to ask, is the complexity of social personae correlated with social complexity? In some cases, more complex societies have more dimensions in terms of rank and social position, and these dimensions can cut across egalitarian principles of age, sex, and personal achievement. So in many ways, this second hypothesis is true. Third, Sachs proposed that lower status personae have fewer items than others, and higher status individuals have more items than others. This is the case in egalitarian societies. In stratified societies, it is true within each stratum or within each class. Fourth, the greater a person's status, the more likely that their most significant identities are represented at death and at the expense of their lesser identities. So here we need to ask, well, what does this really mean? It means that higher status individuals would have representations of higher status. They're not going to emphasize their lower status elements. If you have, let's say you have a ruler who also plays chess, and chess is not seen as a high status activity. They're not going to emphasize their role as a chess player. They're going to emphasize their role as a ruler, something more high status, or someone in the elite. So high status individuals would have representations of high status, and low status individuals would have representations of low status. We need to ask, is this the case in America? No, and this is not always the case in the world either. So there's some problems with this one. Fifth, the higher the degree of redundancy in burial attributes, the more complex and hierarchical the society. Sachs didn't actually test this hypothesis, but we can think about it. The higher the degree of redundancy in burial attributes, the more complex and hierarchical the society. What's the difference between having 1 cup in a grave versus having 50 cups in a grave? In many societies in the past, you would have burial assemblages, grave goods that could include feasting sets. Why include the whole set? Why include 50 cups when the decedent would really only need 1? That's what we mean by redundancy. This is a very difficult. Very difficult hypothesis to test, and that's probably why Sachs didn't actually test it. Sixth, the simpler the society, the greater the likelihood of a relationship between the number of components and symbols and the number of contrast sets to define them, as well as the social significance of the symbols. Sachs felt that this hypothesis needed to be reconceived before testing. Seventh, the simpler society, the less funerary variation there is in the treatment of deviants. Again, Sachs didn't test this one. The simpler a society, the less funerary variation there is in treatment of deviants. What defines a simple society? That's probably the big problem with this one. And finally, eighth, the formal disposal areas for the dead are exclusively for burial of the dead and are maintained by corporate groups legitimizing, through descent from the ancestors, their rights over crucial but restricted resources. What is Sachs saying here? He's essentially saying that cemeteries are maintained by descendant groups, and those descendant groups use those cemeteries as spaces to claim territory and resources. This is not necessarily something that we do today in Western American society, but many other cultures do practice this. They will bury their dead in locations that basically stake a territorial claim. So this last hypothesis is very, very important. For example, in Papua New Guinea, if land was scarce, the dead were buried in cemeteries. If land was not scarce, disposal of the dead was not formalized. When land was scarce, people wanted to be able to say, this is our land because our ancestors are buried on it. But when land is not scarce, it's not all that important. And this can be applied elsewhere too. For example, Native North Americans constructed formal disposal areas. In some cases, these are mounds, burial mounds, that were permanent and specialized visible markers, legitimizing rights over scarce resources. In many cases, these burial mounds, if they are burial mounds, are situated near water or are situated near other resources, such as chert outcrops where you can get chert or copper. There's a lot of variation here. Likewise, disposal areas represent corporate groups that maintain rights to the area. What you're looking at here is an orthophoto on the left. This is an aerial photo. And on the right, you're looking at a return from LiDAR. So you're actually seeing a laser created this where you could see the topography, very, very detailed topography here. And you can see the mounds, and you can see there are quite a few of these mounds. And a lot of these mounds are shaped in the same way. They're bear mounds. And then there's a big bird mound as well on the left, or on the right, sorry. Perhaps the bear mound is symbolizing one particular corporate group. Perhaps it's symbolizing a bear clan. And maybe that bird symbolizes a bird clan. But there's more bears than there are birds. So perhaps at one point in time, you had a shift in the landscape in terms of the social landscape. And at one time you had maybe a shift in the demographics. And there were people who affiliated themselves with a bird clan instead of a bear clan. We can see that by marking the territory in this way, you're marking that it is your land. It's your clan's territory. That's it for this lecture. Please remember to complete all assignments and discussions in the module before the posted due date, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.